especially in the area of work that I've got, focusing on those human connections, there's something intrinsically valuable, something intrinsically joyful about learning more about the wonders that there are in the world. I got letters and emails from members of the general public who'd completed the survey. Many of them said, that's the first time anyone's asked me these kinds of questions about kindness. Fundamentally, it's about relationships. And what we found in that study and in many other studies as well is that relationships are crucial. And it takes me all the way back to why my job is so rewarding, because it's all about connections, and those connections are all about human relationships.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Robin Banerjee, Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Sussex. Between 2019 and 23, Robin was the head of the School of Psychology, one of the UK's largest, strongest and most vibrant psychology schools. And today, Robin serves as the university's inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Global and Civic Engagement. We'll come back to that shortly. Robin is a Sussex lifer, taking his BA in social psychology and his PhD, or DPhil as only Sussex and Oxford call their doctorates, at the university, before going on to run the faculty. His research focuses on the social and emotional development of young people, and he works closely with practitioners and policymakers in the area of education and mental health. He founded the Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness, an interdisciplinary research centre focused on illuminating the nature of kindness and its impact on people and communities. We will most definitely come back to that. In a rich and varied research career, Robin's also led work on the role of television in people's lives, social and emotional skills, peer relationships, mental health in school, and empathy and reading fiction. I think we could fill 4 episodes of the podcast with these topics alone. Now, it's great to have you with us, Robin. You're very welcome. I trust that that's a decent summary of who you are and what you do.
That was very nice. Thank you, Sam.
Anything you'd like to add? Anything I've got wrong?
No, that feels like quite enough, actually. Feels like a lot to do.
I agree. Now, listen, before we focus on your work and on data, obviously this is a podcast about data malarkey, or rather non-malarkey in data. I want to start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about the 9 to 5. So tell me, Robin, if you would, how do you spend your time?
How do I spend my time? Well, I have to say, quite often feeling like I'm in a bit of a whirlwind, because the role that I have now as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Global and Civic Engagement is all about engaging with stakeholders locally, nationally, and internationally. It's all about our connections with people. And I suppose that's really what I would say I spend my time doing, is making connections and really thinking about what we can do with those connections to advance the kind of shared goals that we have. And that might be people in the public sector, in local authorities, in the health services and social care or the justice system, or it might be industry and enterprise, or it might be culture and heritage. You can see why it feels a little bit like a whirlwind quite often. So that's what I spend a lot of time doing. But alongside that, I'm really fascinated by my own psychology research. And that remains an area of interest. And I have to say, it brings me further into contact with really amazing people, and making connections with people is probably the most rewarding part of the job, I think. Outside of that, I'm very much into music, and also something you might not know so much about. I'm also very into baseball. It's the sport that I grew up with. I didn't grow up in the UK. I went to an American school in Japan, actually. That's what catalyzed the interest in baseball. And I've been coaching baseball for many, many years. And there is a small but lovely, passionate, enthusiastic community of baseball players in the UK as well.
How very, very interesting. I'm a fan of baseball. I have a lot of family in New England. And I mean, you may curse me for saying this. My first ever baseball game was a Red Sox game at Fenway Park, which was...
There you go. Red Sox. No, that's a very good family connection. I've got some family in Boston as well.
Yeah, and I was in Japan last about this time last year, or a couple of months later last year, and went to the Tokyo Dome to see.
Oh, wonderful!
I found baseball in Tokyo to be extraordinary, particularly with every single player having their own song and the orchestra and so on and so forth. I think I'm drawn to baseball in the same way as I'm drawn to cricket. I call myself a data storyteller, and the narrative that lives in the numbers and the RBI averages and
oh my goodness, it's absolutely full of statistics, and every single game generates thousands more statistics. It's quite overwhelming, but it is incredibly enticing as well to really make sense of the sport and every aspect of the sport through numbers. And that has become just part of the psyche of how we all approach it.
Now we mustn't geek out too much on the RBI averages of different seasons. But when you talk about your role of Pro Vice Chancellor, I mean, this is right across the university, across every single school, every single discipline, kind of almost discipline agnostic.
It really is. It's the whole university, and that's been a really interesting transition for me as well, because previously, as you said, I was the head of the School of Psychology, which itself was a really big enterprise. It's one of the largest schools of psychology in the country. And it's very comprehensive in nature, everything from the basic biological foundations of our psychology, from neuroscience, all the way through to the big group cultural dynamics that are operating in our world. And of course, we have that here on our campus, actually, because we have an incredibly internationally diverse campus as well. So even just focusing on the School of Psychology felt like it was a huge range of topics all the time. And now, as you say, I've got a university-wide role. So it's everything from the arts and humanities, the social sciences, engineering, medicine, all the natural sciences. It's fabulous, actually. I'm gonna say the whirlwind is fabulous. It's a really, really fascinating experience. And every day brings a unique set of new inputs. And I will say that, Sam, it brings a new set of data as well every single day, because I'm making connections with stakeholders all over the world and in our local area. And it is quite overwhelming, but there's something really positive that you can get from wading into that data that covers every topic you could imagine, everywhere that you could imagine, and realizing actually there's joy in there. There is real joy in those connections, and the data help us to make those connections. And I think that's really important, and to be strategic about which connections are going to be particularly important at which time, all of those kinds of questions. And although sometimes it can feel like the more you find out, the more you realize you don't know. That's what happens, right? Once you start digging into the data, you start realizing, oh, there's this as well. I never even thought about that. But there's huge amount of joy that you can find in that, because especially in the area of work that I've got, focusing on those human connections, there's something intrinsically valuable, something intrinsically joyful about learning more about the wonders that there are in the world.
I think this is we're heading towards our half century of podcasts. And we've had very, very passionate data hounds. Nobody has ever used the phrase "joy in the data," Robin. So that will definitely be a soundbite from this. And I'm very well aware of having spent about 20 years ago, spent 4 years in the School of Psychology. Actually, there were three experimental, cognitive, and social before they were reunited. And outside of my human psychopharmacology bit, we'd bump into other people who were our peers, and we'd have literally no idea what they were talking about. So I can just imagine, as you expand across the whole university, across all the arts and sciences, how exciting that must be. Now, I want to talk about kindness. I want to talk about your research centre on kindness, and also I think what many people will know, not only in the UK but also around the world, is the kindness test that you ran with BBC Radio 4. Could you tell us about the centre, the project, and a little bit about what you found out about how people's attitudes and experiences to kindness vary across different groups? I know that's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions. Okay, I'll start with the origins of the research on kindness. So as you described in your very kind introduction, I've done a lot of research over the years focused on children and young people's social and emotional development, and particularly was focused on how children and young people are interacting with each other, their relationships, particularly in the school setting. And that took me into the territory of learning more about mental health and well-being at school. And it was in that context that a wonderful student who went on to do a PhD with me, Jess Cotney, came to me when she was doing her master's, actually at another university. She came to me and said, I think what you're doing fundamentally is all about kindness. And I thought, that's really interesting. I hadn't used that word in my academic research. I hadn't been typically talking about the work that I was doing in terms of kindness. But as we discussed it, I thought, yeah, that's true. A lot of what I'm doing is focused on human beings being kind to each other. And what does that mean? What's involved in it? What are the obstacles or barriers to it? What facilitates it? And in particular, in the context of schools, what does it even look like? What does it look like in a school context? What does a kind school look and feel like? And I was asking that question about the children and the young people, but then I realized, of course, this isn't just about the children and young people. It's about the school as a workplace. It's about the staff interacting with the children and young people, and frankly, the staff interacting with each other and with the visitors in the community. You realize that you can go outside of the school gates and you're still kind of in the school community. All the parents, the carers, the families, and the community connections. And it was in that context that the work on kindness began to really gather momentum, because as you will probably remember, Sam, Sussex is a very interdisciplinary space. People do connect with each other and make that effort to try to understand where the other people are coming from, and to try and make sense of those different perspectives, and to try to connect again. And I started talking about kindness with other people, and before I knew what was happening, I was finding that kindness was energizing people in the business school, in the medical school, in social work, in politics, anthropology, and so on. All with a very similar reaction in most cases. We don't normally use the word kindness in the research area, but that's actually a really interesting lens through which I can understand these topics that I've been researching. And that's how this interdisciplinary focus on kindness came to be. And a couple of years ago, we formally launched the Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness with our new director, Gillian Sandstrom, a wonderful, wonderful researcher, a social psychologist, who does lots of work on talking to strangers, which we might come on to a little bit later. But that was the origin of this work. It was really about those interdisciplinary connections, unlocking a new way of thinking. And of course, kindness is something that intuitively engages people. And that's what we found when we began working with the BBC, and particularly our wonderful Sussex alum, Claudia Hammond, who graduated from psychology at Sussex many, many years ago. She is our visiting professor for the understanding of psychology, and she's also the presenter on BBC Radio 4 of All in the Mind, as well as many, many other wonderful programs. And Claudia and I hatched this plan to do a really large-scale survey. And we got the support from the BBC for this. And we got an agreement that we were going to run a series of programs based on the results from the research. And it was absolutely fascinating, Sam. I mean, talking about large data sets, we had over 60,000 people taking part in this online study. It was a lot more than we expected. And I was really interested in that because I wasn't sure at the beginning, is this going to appeal to people? Are people going to be interested in this? And it really did. Now, I will say, and something we might come back to later, this happened in the context of the COVID pandemic. It was 2021 in the summer. That's when we ran the survey. And the responses just kept pouring in. And I'll tell you, I got letters and emails from members of the general public who'd completed the survey. And many of them said, That's the first time anyone's asked me these kinds of questions about kindness. And it really made me think. And I thought that was really interesting because actually that's been my reaction. That's been my academic reaction. That's been my colleagues' academic reactions. We tend not to use the word in scientific research, but actually there is a growing momentum around this now because people are seeing that that is something fundamental about human beings. And as you say, there were differences between different groups, and we saw differences related to gender. Women are more likely to report being kind, receiving kindness, and seeing kindness, which is really interesting. There were some geographical differences within the UK, but not all that much. But sometimes you found big geographical differences at a nuance level internationally. For example, when we asked, this was one of the things, Sam, when we asked about the impact of COVID, if they thought there'd been any impact of COVID on people's levels of kindness, the overarching message was, yes, absolutely. But the level of that impact and even the valence of that impact, positive or negative, was not the same everywhere. So interestingly, in the UK, about 70% of people said that they felt COVID had made people kinder, more kind. And in the US, it was the opposite pattern. It was probably about half of that. Most people actually thought it had made people less kind. Isn't that fascinating? So you get these really quite nuanced differences. And I mean, I could go on and on. The correlation of reports of being kind with income, absolutely zero. And you know how when you've got a huge data set, you've got enormous statistical power. Like if there's even a hint of something, you're probably going to find a statistically significant effect. But this one, the correlation was exactly zero between income and reports of being kind. It was absolutely fascinating. So you do get variations, but there's some general patterns here, which are just absolutely fascinating. And in fact, sometimes when you don't find an effect, that's fascinating too.
Two things that immediately spring to mind. I hear what you say about interdisciplinarity. Before I spent some time inside of Sussex, lots of people when I was living down here before I was part of the community, and I was a mature student then rather than an undergraduate. I was a classicist before I was a psychologist, I thought, yeah, interdisciplinarity, absolutely. But I mean, really, kind of from Asa Briggs arriving from Oxford with his spade onwards, it's been riven through the culture, which I think is, and it really does mean something. When you say you were surprised and then others were surprised, and it's not really until you created the Sussex Centre and have done this work, it wasn't really a topic that had been, I don't know, worthy of, or at least labelled with kind of scientific respect or credibility, and clearly you're helping to change that. One question, kind of, why do you think it hadn't really been looked at before? And the second thing that came to mind is, if you're looking at kindness, you're presumably looking at unkindness too.
Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting question because you're right. It feels intuitively so in touch with people because everyone knows what it feels like when someone's kind to them. And taking your other point, everyone knows what it feels like when someone's unkind to you. So why isn't it a topic in research? It's a really interesting question. And I think it actually gets to the heart of one of the problems, I guess, that we keep coming across, which is that kindness is seen somewhat, maybe in academic discourse as well as in the general public discourse, as being kind of soft and fluffy, not really very well defined, and it's just a nice thing, and yeah, that's lovely, and yeah, what else is there to say about it? And actually, I will say that when we first started hatching this idea, Claudia and I, about doing a piece of work on kindness, a lot of people did have that reaction. Like, well, that's nice, but what is there to say about it? Like, what is there to find out? I mean, why would you have a scientific study on it? So it's something that's sort of like so common, so intuitively connected to people's lives that it almost takes it over the line where people are thinking, well, there's nothing to say about it. I mean, we know kindness. It's a nice thing. That's all there is. So I think maybe that problem that we've continued to find actually in different areas and different sectors actually of work, I think maybe that problem plays a role in how much attention it gets in terms of robust scientific research. There's almost a kind of a disconnection, ironically, between that sort of soft, fluffy, intuitive idea about kindness being a nice thing on the one hand, and then the need for really hard-edged, robust, rigorous, maybe data as well on the other side. Like, what is there to say about it? How are we going to measure it? What are we going to do about that? You know, all of those kinds of things. And of course, that to me is like an engine for science now, right? We need to actually answer those questions. So how are we going to measure it? What are we going to do? And, you know, the survey that we ran, that big study with the BBC, that was one component. And yes, it was very large, but it was one component. And ultimately, it was just one perspective. It was a self-report online survey. So there's so much more to do. But that excites me.
You make me think. I do a lot of work in kind of coaching and training, in partly in data storytelling and also in insight and insightful thinking. It's an area of psychology which I think has been under researched and poorly defined. And quite often, when people do come to insight, and I'll give you my working definition of it being a sort of a profound and useful understanding that answers two questions: so what do the data mean, and now what should we do as a result? Very often when insights come, be they in business or in life or in psychiatry, wherever they may be, people will say, well, that's just a statement of the bleeding obvious, isn't it? And actually, surely we've had that thought already. I was wondering, from when you started, from when Jess had this idea, or this idea that your work is in kindness, when you started to where you are now, has your definition of kindness shifted? And either if it has or if it hasn't, how do you define kindness?
I would say that the definition of kindness hasn't really shifted, because it's what we started with. We wanted to keep it at that very intuitive level. So when someone's performing an act of kindness, they're doing something intended to benefit others. That's the key focus. And that's kind of pretty intuitive, and it's pretty obvious. I suppose what my years of doing work in this area have really signaled to me is that word intent is really important. That there's something very fundamental here about motivation. The orientation is not the behavior on its own. And frankly, I think as human beings, and this is outside of academic discourse, this is just as human beings interacting in daily life, I think we know that the behavior can feel very, very different if we imagine that the intent was, for example, ultimately completely self-serving and wasn't intended to benefit us at all. It feels very, very different in that situation. So I suppose what over the years I've been thinking about more and more is that notion of that intention to create those benefits. And we see that in all of the data that we get on kindness. Even if we're talking about where people experience kindness, like in that BBC project, we found that kindness was most often experienced at home. People talked about it being valued, especially in medical settings, in the workplace as well. Let me just say that was very high up on the list. People talked about kindness in the workplace a lot. And I don't mean to say here that people are saying kindness is every moment of every day at work. Clearly, that's not the case. But there is something really fundamental, I think, about where we encounter other human beings who may have that intention to help each other or to support each other or to provide those benefits to each other. And the immediate question that begs then is, so how do we create that environment? So what is it about being at home? What is it about being in a workplace? What is it about being in a medical setting that makes people feel that experience of kindness, at least sometimes? And in many ways, that's a hugely challenging question, because I think fundamentally it's about relationships. And what we found in that study and in many other studies as well is that relationships are crucial. And it takes me all the way back to why my job is so rewarding, because it's all about connections, and those connections are all about human relationships. But it makes you realize, if you're starting with that question, right, I'm in charge of this environment, let's say, maybe the CEO of a big company, how do I make this place feel like a kind place? That's a really, really tough thing to do. How do you make it happen? And I don't think you can make it happen. You have to nurture it. And that's a really interesting question for me. So, sorry, that's a very long, I've gone off on a ramble there, but I've gone off on that detour just to highlight that point that I think the motivational stance, the orientation, the psychological orientation to others really matters.
Hello there, it's your host Sam here. Well, if you've been inspired by this conversation and want to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not visit our scorecard at data-storytelling.scoreapp.com, complete 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a report telling you what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action. I do want to talk about touch on a couple of your other areas of research, but you mentioned COVID and the fact that this was done under COVID. The research was the BBC part of it was done under COVID. And I'm really interested. I mean, big debates in loads and loads of sectors about returning to work or not, and mandates and so on. And the culture of workplaces and kindness in workplaces is clearly facilitated a lot by not by presenteeism, but by people physically being there. You know, a manager with good antennae will see that people are turning up early, leaving late, looking stressed, will go over and have a word. I well remember about 15 years ago, I was working for a lovely guy called Mike Greenlees. He's he's the kind of almost the original madman of advertising. He ran ad agencies, and he was in the last job before he retired. But I was working in his analytics business, and I was in the office late one night. He didn't know me particularly well at the time, and he came over to me, and he put in a sort of godfather manager I would describe him, but a benevolent godfather. I don't mean De Niro or Pacino. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he squeezed my shoulder, and I sort of looked into his eyes. And he said, Sam, why are you here? We've got a meeting tomorrow morning, the board meeting tomorrow morning at 8:00. And I said, yeah, it's my first board meeting. You know, I'm nervous. I want to make sure that I present data in the right way. He said, I understand that. And he said, I've seen this movie, Sam. Nobody dies. Go home. On your way home, buy yourself a decent bottle of wine, have a glass with your wife, go to bed, and come back in the morning, and it'll be fine. Now, I thought that was, I can remember, I can sort of feel my scalp tingling when I that relief left me, and that was an act of kindness. Now, if we'd have been working together, or anybody had been working together, and we'd have had Teams meetings, and we'd either because it was under lockdowns or not. He wouldn't have been able to see me sweating at home doing that. Do you have either any data or any anecdotal evidence, or are you looking into the area of kindness in workplaces that are hybrid or virtual? I mean, that must really make things tricky.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's a really lovely example. Unfortunately, I don't have data on that. But I think it's data that we need to collect, actually. I think these are really, really timely questions that we need to address. And learning more about what's happening in different workplace environments is absolutely critical, because, of course, we spend so much time there, don't we? And I think the description that you gave from that lovely example was all about human connection and the opportunities for human connection. Now, I don't want to immediately dismiss online connections, because actually I think those online connections can be hugely meaningful. And we know in the world now, I mean, all of us, including, I would say, children and young people, are making some really deep connections with others online as well. But we know there are risks to that. We know there are some really significant risks to that. And we also know that they're simply not the same as the interactions that we have when we're in person. And that just feels intuitively true. And I think everybody will be able to say, when they're in a workplace as well, doing the meetings on Teams or Zoom is just not the same as doing it in person. And there might be advantages as well as disadvantages, but they're just not the same. So I agree with you. We need to have more data on that. And there is a really fascinating point about how much do we need those in-person connections in order to really create that culture of kindness. You've given me another idea to take forward in research. It is fundamental.
The next research grant is written.
Indeed.
Now, looking at some of your other research interests, can you tell us about the work you've done in the role and meaning of television in people's lives?
Oh, yes. So this was interesting. I'll tell you, this was a very different origin, although I'm sure it was connected to the work that we'd done with the BBC on the kindness test, because people had seen that. That got quite a lot of media attention, so people were really interested in that. I got approached about doing something similar in terms of the format, a big online study, a big online questionnaire, but particularly to mark the centenary of the Radio Times. So in September 2023, Radio Times was 100 years old. And it was in the lead up to that I got in touch with the magazine, or rather the magazine got in touch with me to say, we'd be really interested to do something focused around how people are engaging with television today, thinking about the vast changes that have happened over the last 100 years and how we consume television, right? Think about online streaming. People are watching what they want, when they want, where they want. And at any given time, people would be watching different things. That's one of the big differences, right? Compared to scheduled TV, where everyone was just watching the same thing at the same time. And I thought this was really interesting. And I suppose the connecting thread is that point. Connection again. I was really interested in that. I was particularly taken with that idea of what's the role of social connection in TV today. And so that was one of the big themes that we focused on. And actually, one of the sort of media headlines that they came out with after we did that study, which was another big study, we had over 20,000 people completing that for Radio Times, was the importance, the continuing, enduring importance of social connection. Because guess what? It was still a very, very powerful factor in consumption of television, even in the age of online streaming. And so the headline that the Radio Times used at that time was, the water cooler moment is not dead. And it's absolutely true. What we found was that it was quite extraordinary. It's like 99% of people, it was virtually every single person who responded to the survey said that they talked at least sometimes, at least on occasion, they talked about what they'd seen on television to other people. And not only that, but when we delved into the psychological motivations for watching particular genres, the last program they watched, when we asked about binge watching, lots of episodes in one go, all of those kinds of things, one of the things that came out again and again was the social factor. People talked about being able to make connections with other people. People even felt connections with the people on the TV itself, right? In the programs, the characters, the presenters. I mean, I would say, of course, being entertained was a huge factor. Actually, that was the most dominant factor in terms of motivations for watching TV, being entertained. And learning new information, getting new information, learning new things, that was second highest, I think. But social reasons, they were probably, when we asked about the dominant motivation, it probably took up about a third of why people were watching TV. I thought that was really fascinating, that a third of the reasons that people were giving for watching TV was actually something to do with making connections. And again, it underlines that point that social connection is just fundamental for human beings. And we saw that even at a micro level, we saw that people's levels of empathy was related to the kind of genres of TV that they preferred to watch. Probably won't surprise you. Reality television, dramas. Of course, drama is very, very popular. But in those situations, it isn't just about being entertained in a completely passive way. We're doing some work, right? I don't want to make this sound like engaging with television programs or engaging with what we see on the screen. And this is something that millions of people are doing every single day, that this is something like completely passive, that you're not doing anything, you're just receiving information. People are not just receiving information, they're actually working at an emotional level. There's empathy which is being driven through these experiences. And I think that's just fascinating.
I want to come back to empathy very shortly, but before we were talking, before you talked a bit about that research with the Radio Times, I was thinking, I'm so old. I remember Who Shot JR and Royal Weddings and Euro '96, and I wrote down as you were talking the phrase water cooler moments. And I thought, well, there's many fewer of those, and surely the only ones that exist now are live sport. But actually, live sport, elections, Strictly, Traitors, I'm a Slow. Actually.
Exactly.
Those broadcasts, and although if you, I mean, clearly, I do a lot of work in the media world, but clearly, as you look at the trends, because as you say, we can watch anything, anytime, anywhere. The trends of people watching linear live TV are going down a lot, because we've only got so many hours in the day. We may have increased our media consumption, but actually, there's a huge number, and that empathy point I think is really interesting, because the role of recommendation, it may not be so much everybody every day talking about what they saw last night, but it may well be there's a sort of culture of have you seen the next episode of Severance? Yeah. Oh, I won't say anything. Exactly. What you mean you haven't watched? And that sort of empathy of recommendation, people coming to ask for that. Now, talking of empathy. As I say, I describe myself as a data storyteller, and I train corporate executives and academics and finance and pharma, and I'm looking at the way that data is used. People are using data to build their stories. And most of the time, I'm not remotely anti-data. I'm very pro-data used well. But most of the time, I'm helping, particularly those that work a lot with data, to display empathy and humanity and a respect and an understanding for the data tolerance of their audience. Right. So, to move others to action, you need and help them make decisions. You need to give them some information, but you also need to balance that emotional and the rational. Can you talk to us a little bit about your research on empathy and reading fiction? I mean, I guess, is this similar to what you discovered in TV?
This is a really interesting connection, and I'm realizing here that all of the things we've been talking about do have a connection with empathy, because, of course, empathy is very often seen as a kind of foundation for kindness, right? Empathy is like the engine that drives kind behavior, because that creates the intent to help someone. So that's kind of interesting. And, of course, then we have the TV stuff. And empathy and books is another example of how we can bring out those human connections and those emotional connections. This is a piece of research that we're doing with primary school children. So the focus is on how reading books might be creating the conditions for developing empathy. And actually, it stems from some work which got a lot of attention probably about 12, 14 years ago, or something like that. Some research that had been done which showed with adults that reading a passage of literary fiction could lead to improvements in some tests of so-called theory of mind, which is all about our understanding of mental states. And the suggestion was that just reading some literary fiction could drive forward some improvements in understanding mental states. And that got a huge amount of attention. And I will say it actually got a huge amount of replication failures as well. People tried to replicate the experiment and it didn't come up consistently in the replication studies, but there does seem to be something happening there. And I thought, well, intuitively, it kind of makes sense, but working with adults who are, yes, they're still developing all of those skills, but they are adults, they're matured already. I wonder what this would look like with children and young people, because children and young people are navigating this new social world at school, engaging with peer relationships and having to work out how to make sense of it all. And of course, they're also learning to read. It's a time when change is happening. And as you know, Sam, time when change is happening is a great time to be collecting data because we can actually follow those changes and make sense of those. And so we began to do work on the development of empathy with attention to what children are reading and how much they're reading. And we thought that might be the place where we could do those experiments and actually have a case of developing empathy through structuring activities to foster more reading. What would it look like there? So we've ended up running a study. This is with my collaborators in the School of Psychology here at Sussex. We have been running a wonderful, wonderful program of research focused on the connections between empathy and reading. And it's been really, really interesting because our preliminary results, we haven't finished the project yet, but the preliminary results are indeed suggestive of these close positive links between empathy and reading fiction. So something seems to be happening when children are reading, which actually builds their understanding and emotional response to the world of emotions.
Enabling them to mind travel and put themselves into the mindset and shoes of other characters.
Exactly. And this is research which, as I said, there's been lots of interesting studies done which speak to bits of this puzzle, but this project that we're running is the first time we're kind of putting them all together. And I have to say, we're working with an absolutely brilliant impact partner, Empathy Lab, set up by the wonderful Miranda McKerney about 10 years ago, focus on exactly this topic, focus on working with schools to support them to promote empathy and social action through the vehicle of children's books. And we've got a lot of support from wonderful children's authors, publishers. And it's just a magical experience, really, because it is fundamentally all about connecting people with each other. And you see, I'll come back to that word that I used at the beginning. You see the joy on children's faces and on the staff members' faces and parents' faces when they're engaging with this wonderful world that authors have created in their books. It's absolutely amazing.
A previous guest on the podcast, I've talked a lot about the theory of mind with Simon Baron-Cohen from the Autism Research Centre at Cambridge. So I'll draw an explicit link in some show notes. Now, you mentioned there actually quite spontaneously in this area of research the kind of the failure for replication, and many areas of psychology have suffered for a long time from this replication crisis. That is, the results in one lab can't be replicated in another, and partly because of the weird subject groups, the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic subject groups. Can you give me an example, or rather the worst example of a misuse of data that you've come across in your career? Not asking you to single out colleagues, of course, but an example of a misuse of data.
I'm not sure if this is cheating, really. I feel like I want to turn it around. And no, it is a misuse of data, actually. But I want to turn the question around in a way that might actually surprise you, Sam. I'm going to say that we sometimes run the risk of thinking that nothing is going on when we don't find an effect, right? And actually, it's almost there in the wording that we use, right? The words that you use just now, replication failure, right? Makes it sound like, oh, you didn't replicate this. There's nothing going on there. And especially if you get lots of replication failures, you might say, oh, there's no effect here. And I think that's a misuse of data in itself, to interpret a replication failure as meaning there's nothing going on here. Because to say there's nothing going on here is a really strong statement. And I'm not sure that we've always really justified that statement, because I think what happens, and you kind of gave me a lead into this actually through what you were saying about, well, it wasn't found in this lab. Maybe it was to do with the sample. It was in a different place, different cultural group. And to me, that's really fascinating. Why did we find something here, but not there? And I'm going to come to a point which sometimes people get cross with academics about, but I think is just true, and not only true, but deserving of attention. And that is the phrase, well, it depends. Now, I know that people like to see really strong statements. This is the effect of X on Y. That's it. And it's kind of annoying when academics come in and say, well, it depends. But I think that throughout all of my research, I keep finding that conclusion. Well, it depends. And unpacking that phrase, I think, is really important. So I would say the misuse of data is when we take a null finding and we say nothing going on here, because we can say, with respect to that particular hypothesis, we haven't found support for it, right? But could it be different for different people? Could it depend on when it happened? Could it depend on where it happened? Could it depend on the circumstances? Actually, it might do. And I think if you've got good theoretical reasons to explore those interactions, X might have an effect on Y like this, in this place, in this situation, under those circumstances for these people, but not for those other people in those circumstances, in those places. I think that's terribly important.
That's an extremely good answer. I'm reminded, another previous guest is Professor Angela Gallup, who's the forensic scientist of her generation, the one who worked out Damblola Taylor, Stephen Lawrence, Rachel Nickel, and she's written a number of books. The first book she wrote is I guess a tale of her career, of the cold cases that she solved, and it's called When the Dogs Don't Bark. She said, when the dogs do bark, that's absolutely fine. You know something's going on. The sheep are being rustled, but it's when the dogs don't bark that you've really got to look. So I completely take that point that a null finding does not mean that there's not necessarily anything of interest going on.
Exactly. And you know what? The way I think about it often is that, as you know, in our analysis of quantitative data, we often find a huge amount of noise in the data. Right? And I'm always thinking, Sam, that noise in the data is created by human beings. When we're doing psychology research anyway, they're created by human beings, and stuff is happening to those human beings. We're giving them measures which we know are imperfect, right? They're not the measure, they're imperfect measures. And when someone is answering those questions, a million things are going to be going on. Now, I accept that there are limits to the value of diving into the noise. But I have to say, in my research areas, diving into the noise has sometimes been the most illuminating thing that I've done.
Fascinating. Now, of course, I've got to have what I might call a Columbo question, just one more thing question. In the way that you work with data, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have done?
You know, what you could have asked me about was my own approach to data collection and data analysis, in particular with regard to quantitative versus qualitative data. And I would say that all of my research training And the dominant approach that I've used and still use has been quantitative. But I also would like to say that over the last 15 years of my career, I've begun to do more and more qualitative data as well. And I've learned so much from bringing the two together because, of course, as you know, it's not one or the other. These are not mutually exclusive. And actually, you can get so much from both. And the idea that somehow the quantitative data is the real story can immediately feel completely wrong to you when you go and do a piece of qualitative research and you dive in. Because fundamentally, what you're, of course, doing quite often in the qualitative data is you are diving into the noise. But my feeling is that what you're able to do is then bounce one off the other. And I really love that aspect of data collection and data analysis, the finding that actually we can do that really big, deep dive into what's going on for a person in a particular situation at a particular time and learn about the richness of that experience. And that can stimulate more questions for maybe some of those interaction effects that we might want to study in the quantitative data analysis as well. So I really have learned over the course of my career that the connection, I'll use that word again, that connection between the qualitative and the quantitative is immensely important for deriving new science.
Perfect. And now finally, where can our listeners and our viewers find out about you and your work and what you're up to online or in social media?
You can find me online on the Sussex website. So just go to the University of Sussex and you can type in my name and you will be able to find lots there, including the Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness.
Thank you so much for your time, Robin. If only there were more people with your approach to making smarter use of data, there would be a lot less malarkey in the world of kindness in particular and psychology in general, and rather more data-driven common sense. Professor Robin Banerjee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalised report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.